The wagon left her by the roadside, a single valise tossed in the dust beside her. Wheels churned mud, indifferent. The driver didn't look back. No one ever looked back. Elara stood, a slight figure against the vast, bruised sky of an early winter. The wind, already sharp with ice, whipped her thin shawl around her, tugging at the stray hairs that had escaped her tight, severe bun. Her face, pale and drawn, showed no expression. It hadn't for a long time. She was a vessel, emptied of all but the thrumming echo of fear and a deeper, colder shame. The town, a huddle of grey buildings a mile distant, had already passed its judgment. She'd seen it in the narrowed eyes, the pursed lips, the way mothers pulled their children closer as the wagon rumbled through. They knew her kind, or thought they did. A woman alone, with no story she was willing to tell, was a dangerous thing, an infection. She bent, slowly, picked up the valise. It was light. It held everything she owned, which was next to nothing. The cold seeped into her bones, a familiar companion. She started walking, not towards the town, never towards the town, but away, towards the skeletal fingers of the distant woods, towards the rise of land that promised nothing but more emptiness, more wind. He saw her. Silas. From the window of his stark, weathered cabin, set far back from the road, almost swallowed by the encroaching pines. He saw the wagon, the discarded figure, the slow, deliberate turn away from humanity. His face, a road map of harsh weather and harder memories, remained still. A flicker, deep in his grey eyes, was the only sign of life, like an ember stirred in cold ashes. He knew that kind of aloneness. He lived it. Breathed it. His wife, Sarah, and their boy, Tom, gone these 10 years. The silence they left was a living thing in his house, in his heart. He watched her trudge, a dark speck against the snow-dusted earth, until she was almost lost to sight at the edge of his sprawling, untamed property. He said nothing. He did nothing, not then. But as dusk bled purple and black across the sky, he pulled on his heavy coat, took down the lantern. He walked the path she had taken, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. He found her huddled at the base of a great, gnarled oak, the valise clutched to her chest. She didn't look up when his shadow fell over her. She probably thought it was an animal. Or worse. He set down the bundle he carried, a thick wool blanket, a tin of beans, a piece of hardtack. He didn't speak. He turned and walked away, the lantern light swinging a lonely arc through the darkness. The wind howled, carrying the scent of snow and pine, and perhaps, a whisper of something else. Something like a choice. Elara waited until the sound of his footsteps faded completely. Then, slowly, tentatively, her frozen fingers fumbled with the string on the bundle. The blanket was coarse, but warm. The beans were cold, but they were food. She ate, huddled deeper under the oak, the blanket wrapped tight. She didn't cry. Tears were a luxury she couldn't afford, a weakness the world feasted upon. She just existed, a fragile pulse in the heart of the wilderness. The next morning, she began to gather fallen branches. Small at first, then larger. Her hands, unaccustomed to such labor, were soon raw, bleeding. But she didn't stop. She had seen a small, sheltered dell, not far from the oak, a place where the wind seemed to soften its bite. It was there she would build. She had to. There was nowhere else to go. One log at a time. That's how you built a life, or what was left of it. One painful, back-breaking piece at a time. The first few days were a blur of cold and exertion. Elara scavenged timber from the forest floor, dragging fallen limbs, her slight frame straining against their weight. Her hands, chapped and blistered, ached constantly. The wind was a relentless tormentor, whipping at her face, stealing the little warmth her body generated. She moved like an automaton, driven by a primal need for shelter, for a space, however small, that was hers alone. Silas watched from a distance. He saw the desperate, almost frantic energy. He saw the raw patches on her hands. He didn't intervene directly. He knew that some things had to be done alone, that the fight for survival was a deeply personal one. But one morning, she found a woodsman's axe leaning against the oak tree where she often rested. Its blade was keen, its handle worn smooth with use. There was no note, no sign of who had left it. She picked it up, the weight unfamiliar but somehow reassuring. It made the work of shaping the logs, of notching them, possible. The next day, a small sack of dried meat and a skin of water appeared in the same spot. He didn't speak. She didn't look for him. The town, when she skirted its edges for some forgotten necessity or to observe its movements, remained a place of hard stares and muttered condemnations. Preacher Thorne, a man whose piety was as starched and severe as his collar, had spoken of the woman in the woods from his pulpit. A Jezebel, he'd implied, a harbinger of ill fortune, living in sin and defiance of God's order. His words fanned the flames of suspicion and fear. Children were told to stay away from the woods, that something unholy resided there. Ilara heard the whispers carried on the wind, saw the fear in the eyes of the few townsfolk she chanced to encounter. It was an old story for her. The judgment. The ostracization. But this time, something was different. The raw, physical labor, the solitude that was chosen, not just endured, began to change her. Each log she managed to lift and place was a small victory. Each swing of the axe a tiny rebellion. The cabin rose slowly, erratically at first, then with more confidence as she learned the rhythm of the work. She found a patch of clay by a small, frozen creek and began to daub the gaps between the logs, her fingers numb but determined. It wasn't just a shelter she was building, it was a fortress against the cold, against the town, against the ghosts of her past. She learned to read the sky, the way the wind shifted, the subtle signs of animal life. The forest, initially a place of menace, began to feel like a gruff protector. Its silence was different from the stifling silence of shame, it was a silence full of life, of ancient wisdom. Silas would sometimes see her pause in her work, her head tilted, listening. Not to him, but to the woods. He recognized that posture. It was the stance of someone learning to belong to the wild, to find solace in its harsh embrace. He mended his fences, chopped his wood, his routines a steady counterpoint to her feverish construction. His presence was a quiet anchor in the landscape, as much a part of it as the old pines and the granite outcrops. He never approached her work site directly, but the path between his cabin and the oak tree became more defined, marked by his regular, silent offerings. A pair of worn leather gloves. A small pot of bear grease for her hands. A sharpened knife. Each item left without ceremony, received without acknowledgement, yet understood. The unspoken language of survival, of shared isolation, was beginning to weave a fragile thread between them. She started to leave small things in return. A handful of late autumn berries she'd found. A strangely shaped piece of quartz. Not payment, but a recognition. A signal. I am here. I am still here. The walls of the cabin reached shoulder height. Ilara worked from dawn until the last vestiges of light faded, her muscles screaming, her breath misting in the frigid air. The rhythm of the axe, the scrape of wood on wood, became the soundtrack of her days. She learned to pace herself, to conserve her energy, to listen to the limits of her body, though she often pushed past them. The shame that had clung to her like a shroud began to feel lighter. Not gone, but less suffocating. It was hard to feel shame when your hands were caked with mud and your body ached with honest labor. The town's disapproval, however, grew louder, more insistent. Preacher Thorne spoke of righteousness and the need to cleanse the community of ungodly influences. His gaze, when it fell upon Silas during his infrequent trips to the general store for supplies he couldn't produce himself, was heavy with accusation. For harboring her, for condoning her presence by his silence. Silas met the preacher's glare with his own unwavering, unreadable stare. He bought his flour and salt, said no more than was necessary, and returned to his solitude. He didn't speak of the woman, or the cabin. His silence was its own kind of wall. One afternoon, as Ilara returned to her construction site after a brief foray to gather dry kindling, she found her small pile of carefully notched logs scattered, some deliberately smashed. A crude cross, fashioned from broken branches, had been thrust into the half-finished wall. Her heart, which had begun to feel a tentative warmth, turned to ice. They had come. The town. Or some of them. To deliver their warning. She stood there for a long moment, the wind tearing at her, the broken logs a testament to their malice. The old fear, the familiar despair, threatened to engulf her. But then she looked at the axe, still leaning where she'd left it. She looked at her hands, scarred and strong. She picked up one of the smashed logs. It was splintered, ruined. She threw it aside and reached for an intact one. She would not be broken. Not again. That evening, Silas found her working later than usual, a fierce, almost desperate determination in her movements. He saw the scattered logs, the crude cross. He didn't speak. He simply picked up a heavy sledgehammer he sometimes used for splitting stubborn rounds and, with a few powerful blows, obliterated the cross, then methodically broke down the damaged logs into firewood. He piled it neatly near her growing wood stack. His actions were economical, precise. He looked at her then, a brief, direct gaze. She met it, her own eyes holding a new, steely resolve. He nodded, once, a small, almost imperceptible movement, and then he was gone. The next morning, a heavy tarp, patched but sturdy, lay folded near her supplies. It would serve as a temporary roof until she could fashion a more permanent one. She began to eat a little more, her frame slowly losing its gauntness. The hollows in her cheeks softened. Sometimes, she would find a rabbit, cleaned and dressed, waiting for her. Or a few hardy winter vegetables from Silas's root cellar. She started to leave a portion of her own meager meals, a piece of bannock cooked over her small fire, by the oak tree. A silent communion. The cabin grew. The roof, fashioned from rough-hewn planks and the top, held against the first heavy snows. Inside, it was small, cramped, but it was hers. She built a crude fireplace from stones, the smoke curling up through a hole in the roof. The firelight flickered, a small beacon of warmth and defiance in the encroaching winter. The wind howled around the small structure, but inside, with the fire crackling, there was a measure of peace. She had built it. One log at a time. And in the building, she had begun to rebuild herself. The first real blizzard swept down from the north, a howling white fury that lasted 3 days. Ilara's cabin, now chinked tight with clay and moss, held firm. The wind shrieked, clawing at the rough-hewn timbers, but inside, the small stone fireplace radiated a steady warmth. She had enough wood, enough dried food. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she felt a sense of security, fragile yet palpable. The endless labor had forged a strength in her, not just of body, but of spirit. The silence of the cabin was a comforting presence, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the roar of the storm outside. She mended her one spare dress, her stitches small and even. She carved a small, rough bird from a piece of scrap wood, its form slowly emerging under her patient knife. When the storm finally broke, the world outside was transformed, a landscape of pristine white, breathtaking and treacherous. Silas's cabin was a distant plume of smoke against the stark canvas. She wondered if he was all right, a thought that surprised her with its quiet concern. Later that day, she saw him, a dark figure moving steadily on snowshoes, checking his trap lines. He paused, looking towards her cabin, a longer look than usual. She was outside, clearing snow from her doorway. He raised a hand, not quite a wave, more a gesture of acknowledgement. She raised hers in return. It was the most direct communication they had ever shared. But the town was not appeased by the snow, or by the quiet diligence of the woman in the woods. The isolation of winter seemed to amplify their fears, their prejudices. Preacher Thorne's sermons grew more fervent. He spoke of a blight on their community, a festering sin that needed to be excised before it brought ruin upon them all. He painted Silas as a man led astray, perhaps bewitched, and Ilara as the source of the corruption. Gossip in the general store and the tavern turned darker. There were murmurs of taking matters into their own hands, of running the woman out, of teaching Silas a lesson. Mercy, some argued, was for the deserving, not for outcasts who flouted God and community. One evening, a rock shattered the small, greased paper window Ilara had fashioned for her cabin. It landed with a thud on the packed earth floor. Her heart leaped into her throat. She extinguished her small lamp, plunging the cabin into darkness, and listened, every nerve screaming. There were voices, low and ugly, outside. Drunken laughter. Then, another rock hit the wall. She clutched the small wooden bird she had carved, its rough edges digging into her palm. She wouldn't scream. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. The voices faded after a while, retreating back towards the town. The next morning, she found footprints in the snow around her cabin, and a dead crow, its neck snapped, nailed to her door. A clear, brutal message. She took it down, her hands trembling, but her face set. She buried the bird in the snow. That day, Silas came. Not to the oak tree, but directly to her cabin. He carried his rifle, not menacingly, but with the casual familiarity of a man who lived by it. He surveyed the damage, the footprints, his expression grim. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "They will come back," he said. His voice was rough, unused, like stones grating together. It was the first time he had spoken more than a single word to her. She nodded. "I know this is my land," he stated, his gaze sweeping the clearing. "They have no right," he paused, then added, "You have a right." Ilara felt a tremor pass through her, not of fear, but of something else. Something like validation. "I won't run," she said, her own voice quiet, but firm. He looked at her again, a long, assessing look. Then he nodded. Good. He turned and walked a perimeter around her cabin, his gaze sharp, noting every detail. He pointed to a section of the wall. "Reinforce this. And keep the axe by the door." He didn't offer to do it for her. He knew she needed to. He was simply offering counsel, the wisdom of a man who understood siege. The unspoken alliance had been forged in shared silence, now, it was being tested by the threat of violence. The fragile peace was over. The confrontation was coming. The town was a coiled serpent, ready to strike. But Ilara was no longer just a victim. She had a home, however humble. She had an ally, however silent. And she was finding a strength she never knew she possessed. One log, one stone, one defiant breath at a time. The air grew thick with unspoken threats. Each trip Silas made to town for necessities was met with colder shoulders, more pointed silences, or outright hostility from Thorne's stanchest followers. They saw his continued tolerance of Ilara not as compassion, but as complicity. He bought his supplies, his face impassive, his eyes missing nothing. He noted the men who gathered in tight knots, their voices dropping when he approached, their glares following him down the muddy street. He knew their kind, bullies emboldened by righteousness, dangerous in their certainty. He began to carry his rifle more openly, not just for game, but as a statement. Ilara, in her small cabin, felt the shift. The forest, once a place of quiet solitude, now seemed to hold its breath. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the undergrowth, sent a jolt of alarm through her. She reinforced the wall where Silas had indicated, her hand steady, her movements deliberate. The axe was always within reach. She slept little, her ears tuned to the sounds of the night. The fear was there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was different now. It was no longer the paralyzing terror of her past, but an alert, watchful readiness. She had something to defend. Something she had built with her own two hands. The small wooden bird Silas had seen her carving sat on the crude mantelpiece above her fire, a tiny, defiant symbol of her claim to this space, this life. He had seen it, and though he said nothing, she saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes when he'd brought her a small sack of grain. He knew what it meant to hold on to small things in the face of overwhelming loss. The whispers from the town coalesced into a plan. Preacher Thorne, fueled by a bleak and unforgiving God, declared that the community must act. They would go to the woman, to Silas, and deliver an ultimatum. Conform, repent, or be driven out. It was for the good of their souls, he proclaimed, for the sanctity of their town. A delegation was formed, Thorn, the mayor, a man whose spine was as pliable as river clay, and a handful of the town's more belligerent men, armed more with self-importance than actual courage, though some carried clubs and old hunting pieces. The day they chose was a Sunday, after Thorn had delivered a particularly fiery sermon. The sky was grey, spitting a cold, miserable rain. Ilara saw them coming from a long way off, a dark procession moving slowly through the sodden woods. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she stood her ground in the doorway of her cabin. Silas was there. He had appeared an hour earlier, as if sensing the inevitable. He hadn't spoken, just taken up a position a few feet from her door, his rifle cradled loosely in his arms. He wasn't looking at the approaching townsfolk, but at the tree line, his gaze sweeping, assessing for any hidden threat. He was a rock, weathered and immovable. The procession stopped a respectful distance from the cabin. Preacher Thorn stepped forward, his Bible held aloft like a shield. His face was stern, his eyes burning with zeal. "Silas!" "Woman!" His voice boomed, too loud for the quiet woods. "We come in the name of decency, in the name of the Lord." Silas slowly turned his head, his eyes, cold as the winter rain, fixing on the preacher. He said nothing. Thorn shifted, unnerved by the unwavering silence, the sheer presence of the man. "Silas, you have harbored this woman. You have allowed a stain upon this community. She lives outside the grace of God, outside the bounds of respectable society." He gestured towards Ilara. "And you, woman. You have brought your sin into our midst. You live in defiance, without husband, without repentance." Ilara felt the old shame try to claw its way back, the familiar urge to shrink, to disappear. She looked at the cabin she had built, log by painful log. She looked at Silas, standing steadfast beside her, a silent bulwark. She thought of the cold, the hunger, the judgment she had endured. And something inside her snapped. Not in anger, but in a profound, weary clarity. She took a step forward, out from the shadow of the doorway, into the bleak light. Her voice, when it came, was low, and rough from disuse, but it carried in the damp air, clear and steady. "I have built my home here," she said, her gaze sweeping over the faces of the townsmen, lingering on Thorn. "With my own hands. I have taken nothing from you." "I have asked for nothing," Thorn sputtered. "Your very presence is an affront. A woman alone, in the wilderness." "My presence," Ilara interrupted, her voice gaining a quiet strength, "is my own. I harm no one. I live by my own labor." She looked directly at Thorn. "Your God, preacher, is he so small that my small life offends him? Or is it you who are offended, because I do not bow to your rules, your judgments?" A stunned silence fell. The townsmen looked at each other, then at Thorn. The mayor shifted his feet uncomfortably. They had expected a cowering, shamed creature. Not this woman, standing straight, her eyes clear, her voice ringing with an unexpected dignity. Silas hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, but his gaze was fixed on Thorn, a silent promise of consequences should the preacher push further. Thorn, for the first time, looked uncertain. His rhetoric seemed hollow in the face of her simple, undeniable truth. "This is not over," he blustered, but the conviction had gone from his voice. "The town will not stand for this." "The town," Silas said, his voice a low growl, "will leave us be. This is my land. She is under my protection." He took a slight step forward, and the menace in that small movement was unmistakable. The group of men behind Thorn stirred uneasily. They had come for a righteous confrontation, not a real fight with a man like Silas. One by one, they began to back away, their bravado deflating like a punctured lung. Thorn, isolated, cast one last venomous glare at Ilara, then turned and followed his retreating flock, his Bible now clutched less like a weapon and more like a comfort. Ilara watched them go, the rain plastering her hair to her forehead. She was trembling, but it was the trembling of exertion, of a battle fought and, for now, won. When they were out of sight, she let out a long, shaky breath. She turned to Silas. He was looking at her, a strange expression on his face, something like respect, something like sorrow, something she couldn't quite name. "Thank you," she whispered. He just nodded, his eyes holding hers for a long moment. Then he looked at the cabin, her cabin. "It's a good cabin," he said. He turned and walked back towards his own home, his silhouette fading into the grey mist of the rain. Ilara stood in her doorway, watching him go. The wind whispered through the pines, no longer sounding like a threat, but like a sigh of peace. She had found her voice. She had found her ground. And in the quiet strength of the man who walked away, in the solid reality of the logs she had stacked, she felt something akin to hope. A defiant peace settled over the small clearing. The cabin stood, a testament to resilience. She was home. The seasons turned. Winter's harsh grip slowly loosened, giving way to the tentative green of spring. Meltwater trickled, then rushed, in the nearby creek. The forest stirred with new life. Ilara planted a small garden in the patch of earth Silas had helped her clear, rows of hardy vegetables coaxed from the stubborn soil. Her hands, once raw and bleeding, were now calloused and capable, moving with a familiar grace as she tended her crops. The town kept its distance. Thorne's influence had waned after the confrontation. Some whispered he had been humbled, others that he was merely biding his time, but the immediate threat had passed. People still talked, of course. Gossip was the lifeblood of small communities. But now, there was a grudging respect mixed with the fear and disapproval. The woman in the woods, they called her. No longer just a Jezebel, but a woman who had stood her ground, who had built a life from nothing. Silas remained a constant, quiet presence. He didn't visit often, but his tracks were sometimes visible near her cabin, checking for signs of trouble, leaving a snare-caught rabbit or a freshly caught fish by her door. She, in turn, would leave a loaf of freshly baked bread, or a jar of wild berry preserves by the old oak tree, their silent exchange continuing, a language understood without words. Their interactions were still sparse, marked by long, comfortable silences. Sometimes, he would sit on the rough-hewn bench outside her cabin, sipping the chicory coffee she offered, and they would watch the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. He never spoke of his past, of Sarah and Tom. She never spoke of hers, of the events that had driven her to this desolate place. But in the shared quiet, in the mutual respect for each other's solitude and resilience, there was a profound understanding. The love she thought she'd never deserve wasn't the fiery passion of youthful romance. It was something deeper, quieter, forged in hardship and shared survival. It was in the way Silas's eyes would soften almost imperceptibly when he saw her working in her garden, her face smudged with dirt, a stray curl escaping her braid. It was in the way her heart would lift when she saw his familiar figure approaching through the trees, a silent promise of safety, of companionship. It was the love of a found family, two solitary souls who had found an anchor in each other in a world that had cast them adrift. One day, he brought her a small, potted wildflower, its delicate blue petals a stark contrast to his calloused hands. He set it on her windowsill without a word. She looked at it, then at him, a small, genuine smile gracing her lips, a smile that reached her eyes, crinkling their corners. He didn't smile back, not fully, but the harsh lines around his mouth eased. He had mended broken tools, fences, even, in his own way, broken lives. She had built a cabin, a garden, a fragile piece. Together, without ever naming it, they had built a sanctuary. The cabin stood, no longer just a shelter, but a home, filled with the scent of wood smoke and baking bread, with the quiet rhythm of a life reclaimed. The wind still whispered through the pines, but now it carried not just tales of hardship, but also of endurance, of the unexpected grace found in shared solitude, and the quiet dignity of a love earned, one log, one day, one silent understanding at a time. She was no longer the woman left by the roadside, emptied and shamed. She was Ilara, of the cabin, of the woods. And she was, finally, deserving. I will now directly address the viewer as instructed for the CTA. Thank you for watching this story unfold. If Ilara's journey of resilience and Silas's quiet strength resonated with you, please let us know in the comments below. What part of their story touched you the most? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more inspirational short films and dramatic storytelling. Your support helps us bring more narratives like this to life. Click the notification bell so you never miss an update. We look forward to hearing your thoughts.